Alright, hello everybody. Welcome to part 2 of the 5 W's of Planning an Imaging Project. Who and how. Last week, Angela covered the what, when, and why of imaging, so if you've done the math in your head, you probably realize that's only 4 W's, but technically how has a W in it, so you do get 5 W's. And as you'll see, the how of an imaging project is pretty important. Now let me just briefly tell you who we are and what we do here in the Records Management Assistance Unit. There are government information analysts here in the Records Management Assistance Unit who are here to answer any retention questions you might have. We also answer questions on several other aspects of records management, so destruction, managing electronic records, filing systems, disaster planning, long-term preservation of paper and electronic records, you name it. We are basically the Records Management Help Desk of Texas. Alright, let's have a quick refresher of what Angela went over in part 1, which covered the what, when, and why of planning an imaging project. If you saw part 1, then you understand that the project doesn't end at running a sheet of paper through a scanner. Metadata and indexing are vital to being able to retrieve that record again. You know that there are a lot of costs associated with imaging, and you should be selective about what you do scan and when you scan it. Take the time to conduct feasibility studies. And you understand that if you want to save space and destroy original documents, then you must be familiar with Bulletin B or Bulletin 1, and think about the potential risks of eliminating the originals. Okay. Now, at the end of this webinar, we hope that you will come away with some new knowledge. We want you to know the pros and the cons of doing an in-house project or for outsourcing your project to a vendor. You'll be able to understand some of the processes surrounding imaging. If you think that it just involves pressing a button and scanning and waiting for your images to show up, hopefully you will think otherwise at the end of the hour. But most of all, we want you to be better equipped to make decisions regarding your imaging project, whether it's about staffing or what kind of scanner to buy, and of course whether you want to take on the whole project yourself. Really, we just want you to have a good idea of the enormous scope of an imaging project. Now, we'll start today by considering who. Who should do the imaging? Should you do it yourself, or should you hire a vendor? Now, in order to decide that, there's a few questions that you'll need to consider. And these will probably be similar to some of the questions you answered when you decided whether to do an imaging project in the first place. First of all, how much material do you need to scan? If you only have a few boxes of records, it doesn't make much sense to have a vendor do it. But if you have hundreds of boxes, then you might want to consider outsourcing. Also, how much time do you have? If you only have a month or two to scan hundreds of boxes, then you'll definitely want to look at a vendor. But if you have several years to scan just a few boxes, it would probably make more sense to do it yourself. Do you need to take extra care to protect the records or the information inside them? Or is the material particularly fragile or in some sort of special format? Also, as we move through the webinar, you'll see how many steps there are to doing an imaging project. And you might decide that you want to do some steps but not others. In that case, you would have a hybrid approach. Now, in part 1, we have the ZDonk. For this, we have the liger, and this is in fact a real animal. This is Hercules the liger, part lion, part tiger. And basically, with this hybrid approach, you do some of the steps in-house while you outsource others. For example, if you decide to outsource the actual scanning, it's generally cheaper to do the document prep in-house, so that would be a hybrid approach. But for now, let's just go over the general advantages and disadvantages to in-house or do-it-yourself. So one advantage of in-house projects is that you are learning by doing. You're just getting right in there and you're learning about the process as you do it. The process is no longer a mystery, and once you complete one project, you'll be better equipped to tackle other projects in the future, because chances are you will not finish with just one imaging project. You will probably have several imaging projects as time goes on. You can also adjust things along the way. For example, if you decide to scan records at one resolution, but you decide that that resolution is not adequate, or that it makes the files too large, you can immediately decide to change the resolution without having to communicate with a vendor. You also have more control over the entire project, and that becomes especially important when it comes to the quality of the images or the security of the content. If you are imaging records that have a lot of sensitive information in them, you might feel more comfortable scanning them yourself instead of handing them over to a vendor. Also, you know the requirements of the project best. You know what the laws are from us, and you know what your organization wants for the scanned records. A vendor should know those things too, In fact, it should be written into the contract, but it will be at the forefront of your mind during the entire project, whereas that might not be the case with a vendor. Now, there are some disadvantages of doing something in-house. If you're doing your own project and it's your first time doing an imaging project, it is going to be a large upfront investment, and not just cost-wise, but also in terms of effort and time. It's also really difficult to predict those costs. A vendor can usually give you a per item cost, but it's more difficult to determine that when you're doing it on your own. You have to take time and labor costs into consideration, plus overhead, and the cost of hardware and software and any technical support for those things. So there's a lot of different factors that go into determining those costs. Also, there's no getting around the fact that your capabilities and facilities just won't be as fancy or efficient as a vendor's, because it's not your primary business function. And remember how one advantage is to learn by doing? Well, that also means that you're kind of on your own. If you run into a problem during the project, you might not be able to call somebody to fix it. You have to solve that problem, and that could lead to frustration. And there's also staff considerations. You're going to need a wide range of staff expertise to make sure that all parts of the project run smoothly. So now maybe in-house looks pretty daunting. Well, let's look at some of the advantages for using a vendor. Overall, the cost is more predictable. You'll generally pay a per item price that's been agreed upon beforehand. Also, vendors already have the equipment and the staffing and the workflow set up. And because of that, they can usually handle really large volumes of records. And finally, they can do parts of the project or the whole project. Those options and services include document prep, imaging, metadata creation, enhancements, derivative creation, printing, storing and backup, database development. They can do a whole lot of things for you. So, wow, that sounds pretty great. It's more predictable and they can do just about everything. Well, of course, there are disadvantages as well. For one thing, the security and handling of your documents is out of your control, and transporting the records can be an issue. If your vendor is located across the country, will it incur additional costs to transport your records? And as with any project, there's the potential that you could have some miscommunications or misunderstandings. So you have to take extra care to make sure that you are speaking the same language and that you are all on the same page. Also, vendors are businesses, so there's some inherent instability there. What if your vendor goes out of business or merges with another vendor? Or what if their network is hacked and then your scans become vulnerable? These are considerations to consider. But basically what it comes down to is that your organization is removed from the imaging functions. You don't have as much control over the project because you're just simply not there. So whether or not you do a project in-house or outsourced or a combination of the two, people need to be assigned to particular roles. For one, you might want to consider using a systems integrator. This is a person who would make sure that all components of your project will work together, and it's usually somebody from IT. So if you're doing something in-house, they would make sure that the computers will work with the scanners and that all of that will work with your storage. Or if you're using a vendor, they'll make sure that the files you get back will work with your system, that kind of thing. And related to that, you want to make sure that you involve the technical staff early and often. You don't want to plan for a project that your technical staff would not be able to complete. They can help you identify weak links in the project plan when you analyze the technological feasibility of the project, as you talked about in Part 1. Also, consider your users' needs. Imaging and storing records is all well and good, but your users need to be able to access those records. Are you imaging records primarily for internal use or for public consumption? Do you have to make these documents accessible through the web? This will have a big impact on your imaging project. And as with all records management projects, make sure you get support from upper management, and preferably early. It's generally bad form to ask your manager for tens of thousands of dollars for a project that they don't know anything about. Now, if you are thinking about hiring a vendor to do your imaging instead of doing it in-house, there are a few pre-approved vendors that contract with the state of Texas, and they will extend state agency rates to local governments. And there are 3 categories of service they offer. They have project-based services, which are usually large-scale, multi-year imaging projects, and it can include services such as a needs assessment or image repository hosting. They also offer flat-rate services. These are projects characterized by consistent, cost-efficient, flat-rate pricing on a per-page basis. And they also offer preservation services. This is for small to large-scale projects for governments that are historical or fragile and must be retained by a state agency or local government. If you're interested in learning more about this, you can read more on the Council on Competitive Government website. Alright, now that we have looked at some considerations about who to involve in the project, let's talk about all the different components of the project. There's a lot of things to decide on and a lot of different steps that you have to do, so let's go ahead and jump right in. Here are the basic components of an imaging project. First, you'll want to do an inventory of the records you want to image. You want to know what you're imaging and how much you're imaging. And this is also a good time to do a workflow analysis to help plan the project, because you need to plan exactly how a record will move through the process. You don't just want to throw everyone in the deep end and have them doing whatever they want. Also, of course, you need to make sure that you've trained the proper staff in their roles for the project. Of course, somebody will be selecting the materials to be imaged, and you'll recall from part 1 of the webinar how to select those materials. Then you'll need to prepare those documents to be scanned. You'll have to create or choose what metadata you'll use for the project. And once the scanning is finished, you'll need to perform quality control on the images. And once you've scanned your documents and you've done the quality control, then you have to maintain and preserve those records until they've met their retention period. Now, we don't have time today to go over each of these in detail, but we'll look mostly at the last 4 components more closely. And here's another way to look at the project. At the center, you have the goals and deliverables. This is why you want to do the project in the first place. The middle ring is institutional resources, including your collections of records, your personnel, your finances, your space, the time you have, and technical capabilities. And these are the elements that will enhance or constrain your digitization efforts. And the outer wheel represents all the different steps to the project itself. So just a nice visual representation for those of us who are visual learners. Now, there are a lot of decisions that you're going to have to make. Usually, regardless of whether you do it yourself or hire a vendor, of course, that is also a decision that you will have to make. So let's look at all these other decisions more closely. Obviously, the hardware is going to be doing some of the most important work. It captures the images, it stores them, and it retrieves them for later use. And hardware is basically all the machines, the computers, the scanners, and the physical storage media or servers. Now, the thing to keep in mind when selecting hardware is that you want to select it according to what you think your peak workload will be. You don't want your hardware to fall apart when you need it the most because it's only used to handling a lighter workload. And you also need to think if your workload will be increasing from year to year. So it's a delicate balance, but you basically don't want to go for the cheapest option, but you also don't want to go for the most expensive and most advanced machine with all the bells and whistles. You need to carefully select hardware according to the needs of your project and the funding that you have available. So if you do have thousands of double-sided records to scan and only a short time frame to do it in, you want something more suited to the job than simply a flatbed scanner like one that you might have at home. And speaking of scanners, there are a few different kinds to choose from. The kind that you are probably most familiar with is the flatbed scanner. So that's a personal scanner that you have at home, might look like this. And a subset of these is automatic document feeder scanners. Instead of having to lift up the cover and scan each piece of paper, you just put a stack of papers in the feeder like a copy machine. Overhead scanners are used for materials that are fragile or oversized or that are otherwise ill-suited to flatbed or ADF scanners. In this picture, you can also see that it's used for books. Then you also have simplex and duplex scanners. That simply means that they can scan one-sided or two-sided documents. And then we also have high-speed scanners that are built specifically to handle large volumes of paper. And this is a picture of the high-speed scanner that we have here at the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. Now, on a related note, when you're selecting a scanner, you want to look at something called throughput. That's the speed at which your scanner can process images. So if a machine says that it has 60 ppm throughput, that means that it can scan 60 pages per minute. However, companies often inflate these claims, and what they really mean is 60 pages per minute under really unrealistic and optimal conditions. So when you look at these claims, make sure you take them with a grain of salt. Another thing you need to decide is what bit depth you will need. Bit depth refers to the number of bits used to create each pixel, and each pixel is a dot of color on your screen. In general, the higher the bit depth, the greater number of color tones you'll have represented in your image. Another easier way to think of it is bit depth refers to whether the images will be black and white, grayscale, or color. And here's a chart that shows those relationships. If you have a 1-bit image, then the bit is either black or white. So it's black and white. It's best for typewritten documents. 8-bit is grayscale. It's not completely black and white, but it's definitely not color. It's just 256 shades of gray. So that's something that's really good for black and white photographs where you have a lot of different tones of gray. And then you have 24-bit, which is color. So while it sounds really technical, basically when you're deciding bit depth, you're just deciding whether you'll be scanning in black and white, grayscale, or color. And here's a better illustration of bitonal versus grayscale. On the left, you have bitonal. Either the pigment is black or it's white. On the right, however, you can get something in between. You have these shades of gray. And in fact, you can see that you have a lot more information in the grayscale that would otherwise be lost in the bitonal or the 1-bit scan. Another important consideration is DPI, and that's the technical measurement for the resolution of an image. It stands for dots per inch, but sometimes you might see PPI for pixels per inch or LPI for lines per inch. Basically, the higher the number, the higher the legibility and resolution of the reproduced image. However, scanning at a higher DPI does take longer, and it also means that the resulting files can be large and will take up a lot of space on your server. Here's a visual representation of different DPI. As you can see, the 600 DPI has the highest resolution. But keep in mind that these letters have been blown up quite a bit to show these differences. So at a regular text size, such as 10 or 12-point font, the 300 DPI would probably look the way that 600 DPI looks at this size on the slide. Now, our rules require that any documents with 6-point font size or larger be scanned at 200 DPI, and that any documents with smaller than 6-point font, engineering drawings, maps, and other documents with background detail be scanned at 300 DPI. Now, once you scan the records, you have to store them. So here are a few broad guidelines about choosing what kind of storage to use. First off, for storing record copies, the ideal is network-backed storage because it's backed up on a regular basis. Flash drives and optical disks are not ideal. They can be lost or tampered with, and with government records, we really want to ensure the integrity of the records. And you also want to choose storage media that is widely popular and accepted. While the latest and greatest might sound really cool, such as a laser-engraved crystal disk, it might not be around in a few years. So basically, you want to make sure that you have the technical support that you need in the years to come. Now, when it comes to deciding how much storage to buy, make sure that you buy enough to get you through the next few years, but not too much more than that. You don't want to pay for storage that you won't use, but you also don't want to end up running out of room all the time. And of course, do remember that you will be storing backups as well. So when you're trying to choose what kind of storage media to go with and what brand to go with, just look at the following factors. How fast is it? How fast will it read and write your data? How much data can it store? How long will it last before it crashes? And make sure it's standardized. Make sure that it will work with your operating system and your applications. And of course, you want to look at how much it costs and whether it's actually suited to your task. Okay, well, we will move on to software. So software performs almost all the other essential functions of an imaging project. For example, you can't just have a scanner and a computer and hook them up and get your image. You need software to connect the two. Scanner software translates the image captured by the scanner into something that you can actually view on your computer. There's also OCR software, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And then there's all the software that makes your scans more usable. Angela talked about indexing in part 1, but we'll go over it again briefly. And database management systems add indexing information to your image. Now, if you don't want to use indexing or data management software, there's also just software out there that helps make your images more retrievable. Okay, OCR is something that you probably want to consider. It stands for Optical Character Recognition. Now, when you scan a document, it becomes an image on your computer, and you can't search for text in an image. But if you apply OCR to scanned images, the software changes the image of the text into machine-readable text. So here's a screenshot of one kind of OCR software in action. As you can see, both sides are text, but only the right side is actually machine-readable. The one on the left is an actual image of text that appears in, I assume, a book of some sort. Now, the main reason people do OCR is because it allows you to do full text searching or editing on your documents. The problem is errors are inevitable. Sometimes your OCR software will read a Q as an A or vice versa. The good news is that these errors are relatively rare, and if you're as skeptical of machines as I am, you might be surprised to know that OCR documents usually have a 98 to 99% accuracy rate. And the higher the DPI or the resolution of your document, the less errors there will be in your OCR. File formats, this is another decision that you have to make. These are some of the most common file formats used in imaging, and most of these are software dependent. And then you have things like JPEG and PDF, which have variations such as JPEG 2000 and PDF-A. Some of the ones you might not be familiar with are PNG, that stands for Portable Network Graphic, or BMP, which stands for Bitmap. Now, a fairly frequent question we get is, what file format am I required to use? Well, we don't have requirements for file formats, but keep in mind that the format you choose will affect the quality and file size of the images, and usually a higher quality file format will lead to a larger file size. So when you're choosing a file format, keep in mind what kind of material is you're imaging. If you're imaging text documents, you probably don't need to use TIFF. Also, think about retention periods and the frequency and nature of the use of the files. These are some of the questions that you probably consider when deciding to do an imaging in the project in the first place, as you talked about in Part 1. Now, while we can't tell you what kind of file format is required, we can make some general suggestions. As with any electronic record, open source and non-proprietary is ideal. But if that's not possible, go with something that is widely available and accepted or an industry standard. But whatever you choose, the format should be stable, well-supported, and well-documented. If you have some super genius friend who comes up with a new image file format, that's pretty cool, but it's not what you want to use for the files for your records. I actually met somebody recently who oversaw an imaging project in the early 90s, and he asked his technician, okay, so you saved the files as TIFF, right? And the technician said, no, I saved it in my own file format. It's new, it'll be great. Needless to say, the person overseeing the project had a mild heart attack, but luckily they were able to convert the files to TIFF in the end. Now, another decision to make is whether or not you will be compressing your files. When you scan a document, chances are the file that's created as a result is rather large. That's okay for a few files, but when you're scanning thousands of records, that quickly becomes unsustainable. So that's when file compression comes into play. First, you need to decide whether this is acceptable to you or not. For most records managers, it probably is. But for example, if you're scanning photographs of crime scenes, you might not want to compress the file. You might want to keep the file as it was originally scanned. But if you do decide that compression is acceptable, there are two kinds. There's lossless and lossy compression. So with lossless compression, the resulting file will look identical to the uncompressed file, and TIFF is a commonly used format for lossless compression. Now this might sound confusing because if the resulting file looks identical to the original, why is it compressed in the first place? Well, it just looks identical to the real thing. In reality, the file is using algorithms to allow the original data to be reconstructed from the compressed file. So it's sort of like it's a really, really exact recipe where you use 1.5 grams of flour and 2 grams of vanilla extract or whatever to make your pancake or something. For lossy compression, this means that you lose data during the compression process, and JPEG is an example of a lossy compression format. And this means that the reconstruction is merely an approximation of the original data. So it's not a very exact recipe. It's just a handful of flour here and maybe a dash of salt there. So here's a picture of lossless versus lossy compression. Admittedly, neither one of these images is particularly great quality, but you can see that there's definitely a difference in the lossless compression on the left and the lossy compression on the right. Now, are there any questions so far at this point?
Yes, we have one question so far. Someone would like to know about the accuracy rate for OCR. Is the 98% mean that 98% of the words are correct, or 98% of the characters are correct?
I am not 100% sure on this, but I am 98% sure that it is talking about characters, because when you're looking at optical character recognition, when you look at the software, it's looking at each individual character and not words. So I'm inclined to say that it is with the characters, but I don't want to give my absolute guarantee on that. I can get back to you once I do some more research into figuring that out.
And another one came in while you were answering that one. JPEG 2000 is a lossless compression and takes less storage space than TIFF. Is that correct? That's someone's understanding. Is that right?
I am not sure. I would have to do more research into file formats. I didn't want to get too much into it because there's so much to cover in this webinar, but I can certainly look into that. That's good knowledge to know. So we'll get your contact information and I will get back to you.
I believe that's the case. That's what I had heard in the past, is JPEG 2000, the reason it's sort of preferred over JPEG is that it's lossless, and it's definitely smaller in size than TIFF. TIFF is a relatively large file size.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Michael. If there aren't any other questions, then we will move on. So we've talked about all the kinds of decisions that you'll have to make. What kind of scanner to use, what file format to use, and whether or not to use compression or OCR. And once you've made all those decisions, now it's finally time to begin your project. And here are some of the things you have to do. With staff selection, that's kind of self-evident, but you need to have somebody doing all of these steps. Whether that'll be one person doing everything or the steps will be divided among many will depend on your resources. And as you can see, you'll need staff with a wide variety of skills. Now let's go ahead and talk about the rest of these steps. Once you've decided who will be doing what, now it's time to actually make sure that your documents are scanner ready. First, you want to remove everything from the folders or files. Some documents might be folded or rolled, so you will need to carefully unroll or unfold them to get them ready to go through your scanner. And be careful with older documents that you don't rip or tear them while unfolding. And if you have any documents in onion skin, this is a good time to copy them onto regular paper so that they can be read by the scanner. Also, make sure you organize documents in the order you want them scanned, because it's a lot easier to do that than to organize all the electronic files that result after imaging. Also, be sure to correct all the missed files before scanning, because that will help you with your order as well. And this is also a good time to remove any duplicates or convenience copies. As you're prepping the records, you can conduct an audit on items in the file and try to locate any missing documents. Or you can even just take an inventory so that when you finish scanning your records or when you get them back from a vendor, you can be sure that nothing is missing, so nothing was left on the scanner somewhere. And probably the most time-consuming part of getting the document scanner ready is pulling out all the staples and paper clips. You also need to remove any post-its or flags, basically anything attached to the document that might obscure information. Or if you have receipts that you need to scan, you'll want to tape them onto an 8x11 piece of paper to make them more legible. Now for our scanning project that we did here at the library, it generally took about 3 days to prep one lateral file drawer of files. So time and personnel should certainly be considered. And also, if you did manage to tear any pages or if pages were already torn, you want to make sure you mend them before they go through the scanner. So once you have all your documents scanned, how are you going to retrieve them? Theoretically, you could just make sure that you name the files well and then browse for the scans when you need them. But more often than not, metadata is going to play a huge role in retrieving your image. It describes your records and helps you track, organize, and maintain your images. And that metadata is also pivotal to an indexing database. An indexing database will associate particular bits of metadata with particular scans so that you can easily call up a particular image by searching the database for that metadata. And it provides a nicer way to access your files than simply browsing for them on a network drive. And also, databases can help you put controls in place that only allow certain people to access certain images. So let's look at our FileMaker Pro database again. We looked at it in part 1, but here it is again. So each image is associated with a particular unique ID. And that ID becomes the file name, and that particular piece of metadata is vitally important because it's what links the FileMaker Pro record to that exact image when we click on this button. And this is the PDF that gets called up, and you can see that metadata, that government's unique ID, up in the top left corner. Now, it's important to capture the image metadata either at the time that the document is scanned or shortly thereafter. That way, you know that the metadata is correct and you know that it's associated with the correct document. Because you wouldn't want to put the correct metadata for the document that it's not actually describing. Now, we don't have any requirements for what kind of metadata you must capture, but here are a few fields that you'll certainly want to consider. Some of this metadata is going to be created by the system or software, such as the date or the format of the records. But most of these will have to be manually added, so the title, maybe the author, and certainly any keywords or rights or security information that you want to add to a file. Now, how you will decide to add the metadata is going to be a really important part of your workflow. Spreadsheets is one common method that I've seen. And you also need to make sure that your metadata is standardized. You can follow an established metadata schema such as Dublin Core, or you can make your own metadata conventions to make sure that everybody is following the same naming and metadata conventions. So this is an example of metadata attached to a PDF that we have scanned. It's one of our local government compliance files. And all of this metadata is system generated. We have the file name up here, the author. This is either the computer or scanner that actually scanned it. We have the application that was used to scan, the creation and modification date. And over here you can click on additional metadata, and this will take you to the really technical XML and Dublin Core metadata. And you can view this for any PDF. You just have to go to Properties and you can see all this metadata for yourself. So databases use indexing to access your images, but depending on what kind of documents you're using, you might use different kinds of indexes. Now, for example, with employment applications, the index would need to include fields for things like the date of submission, the name of the applicant, the position he or she is applying to, and maybe the department that you forward the application to. Or if you have purchase orders, the indexing can use the date of purchase, the purchase order number, the requisition number, or vendor name. Or it could also include approval name or any other internal process that's different from this. Now, I know this might seem a little tedious, but here's an example of why indexing parameters are important. A school district has scanned all of their student records and decided to throw away the source documents before they actually used their scans. So they received a public information request for a student's transcript information from a college, and they couldn't locate the transcript. They had forgotten the indexing stage in the scanning process, and they did not set up any search parameters. So instead of being able to search the documents by key information, such as a student ID number or graduation year even, they had no ability to search the images. The images were simply in the order that they were scanned in, and they had to go through each individual student file until they found the one that was being requested. So make sure that you have an index that works, that's for your organization's need. And here's an example from Galveston County. They did an imaging project a few years ago. And in this case, they used OCR and keywords to help with their indexing. I apologize for the quality of the image. This is just a screenshot. But you can see that the highlighted text corresponds to the highlighted field. So this purple goes with this, and these green fields go with this in the dialog box. And those are the fields and the terms that they can use to search the documents. Okay, let's move on to quality control. So you can't just scan a bunch of documents and leave it alone. The quality of the scanner's image and the settings need to be periodically tested and adjusted throughout the whole imaging project. You don't want to waste a whole day scanning documents on the wrong settings or on a setting that doesn't allow the images to be viewed properly. And in accordance with state rules, you are required to do a visual check on every image scanned if these scans will be your record copy. If you are only scanning for access copies, you can just check a sample of the records to make sure the visual quality is there. Now, when you do a visual quality control check, you're making sure that images are in the correct position, that images aren't skewed, that they're legible, that there aren't any missing pages or any problematic areas on the page, such as what we see here on the right. And you might also want to print out test pages to make sure that what's legible on the screen is also legible on paper. Also, this is when you can verify that your index is correct and user-friendly, and you can do your indexing and quality control check at the same time. Make sure that you document your quality control procedures to make sure that they're consistent among different employees who do them. And this is also part of ensuring the legal admissibility of scans that you might use in court. You can show that all of your scans go through the same quality control procedures, and you're showing that you're doing what you can to ensure the integrity of the scanned records. Of course, don't forget to back up your scans so that you don't lose any information after scanning. This is another instance where you don't want to waste a week on scanning only to have your server crash and then lose all that information. But basically, all of this quality control is really to make sure that no information is lost. That's the main reason that we do quality control. After that, we have document processing. So there's usually some extra steps between scanning documents and actually using them. So for example, there's rotating. This is really hard to read unless I want to turn my head, 90 degrees, but you can rotate the image and there, you can read it much better. Also, deleting blank pages, they just take up needless space, so you can just get rid of them. And also renaming. You don't want to have, a bunch of scan 001. You want to rename them according to the metadata, the conventions that you guys have agreed upon beforehand. All right, so you've scanned your documents. You have them in a good file format. They're compressed, you've indexed them, you can access them through a database, you've done quality control to make sure the images are up to par. Can you leave the records alone now? Unfortunately, no. You have to maintain the records too. And that means you need to store the media in optimal environmental conditions, you need to ensure the security of those records, you need to refresh or migrate the media periodically to make sure that they aren't becoming corrupt or obsolete, and you need to do everything necessary to retain the records for their entire retention period, and then also make sure that you dispose of those records when the time comes. Now, if you want more information on what exactly the requirements are for maintenance of electronic records, you can find that in Bulletin 1 or Bulletin B. For more detailed guidance on the subject, I highly recommend that you check out our digital preservation webinars, and you can access those at links here. So let's have a quick summary of what we looked at today. We looked at the pros and cons of imaging your records in-house or with a vendor, such as cost considerations, security, control, and technology. We looked at all of the decisions that you have to make, whether it's about what kind of scanner to use, how much DPI you need, and whether to use lossless or lossy compression. And then we looked at all of the steps involved in an imaging project, so prepping the documents, adding metadata, indexing for a database, quality control, and then file maintenance. So hopefully by now you have a better idea of all of the planning and work that goes into an imaging project. And with that, I want to thank you for attending. We are ready for your questions.
Okay, the first question we got is, do you recommend OCR given the extra expense? It seems like through indexing you could accomplish most of what you'd need OCR for.
That is a very good point, and that's going to depend on your project. For us, we don't normally need OCR on our documents because we have that good indexing in that database, and that helps a lot. But if you're going to be looking at more unstructured data where you have to look at the content of the images more often than just accessing the images by themselves, you might want to invest in OCR because, for example, I did once have to look through a 500-page PDF for one tiny thing, and luckily it was in the first 30 pages or so, but imagine if it had been the 450th page. I would have had to actually look at all of those and scan all of those, and that's only once in a while, so we didn't really need the OCR for that. But for projects where you will have to look for tiny, tiny words, keywords here and there, I think it would be very useful. So that's going to be an individual decision that you have to make, but it might be worth it. Any other questions?
Okay, sort of a follow-up to that previous question. Is it possible to scan for OCR after the fact? If you come across an instance where you, just like you mentioned, can you OCR on demand?
Yes, you can. A lot of OCR programs can work. You don't have to do it right when you scan. You can do it after the fact, and I have done that a few times, which has saved my butt. So that is definitely an option. All right, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful week.